What are reserves? In its broadest form, reserves are the difference between the assets and liabilities of a sovereign people. And in principle, this would include not just our financial reserves, which is captured in cash and other financial assets, but all the nation's endowments, her stock of built capital, the buildings, machinery, equipment, and other infrastructure, as well as our natural capital, our forests, reservoirs, and rivers, lands, and biodiversity. But for our purposes here, we are focusing on financial reserves. And in Singapore, reserves are officially defined as the net assets of the fifth scheduled entities in the Constitution. Now, this includes holdings by not just our sovereign wealth funds, or SWFs, GIC and Temasek, but also CPF, HDB, JTC, and MES. The bulk of these likely reside in the SWFs, and with the MES also carrying a non-trivial share. And hence, for practical purposes, it makes sense for us in this debate today to focus on the reserves managed by these entities. It's useful, however, to begin by asking how we even got these reserves in the first place. We do not have many natural endowments, so at the risk of oversimplification, it's useful to think in terms of national income accounting, which requires that any reserves we hold, or for any other country for that matter, derive from only two sources. First, from fiscal surpluses, which is when the government collects more revenue, then spends and it saves the remainder. The second is from current account surpluses, which result when the private sector saves more than invests. And part of this excess saving is retained in the form of foreign currency. Money is obtained from the sale of land or the issuance of government securities, or SGSs, for the purposes of financial development are, therefore, forms of reserve accumulation that derive from fiscal surpluses. Now, the government would like to say that such excess revenue from land isn't just ours to take. Land is limited, and our land endowment belongs to everybody, including future generations. Similarly, legal stipulations mean that any revenue raised from certain classes of SGSs cannot be spent on recurring expenses. But the fact remains that reserves from this source result when there's excess saving by the government, which means taking more income from the people than they would otherwise have been able to enjoy. In contrast, reserves accumulated due to current account surpluses occur when the exchange rate is kept artificially low, or when there's forced saving in the form, perhaps, of CPF, over and above what households may themselves wish to set aside. A weak exchange rate makes our nation's exports more attractive, no doubt. But let's be clear. It comes on the backs of what we could otherwise import. A weak exchange rate also means that our people have less purchasing power to buy things from the rest of the world. And forced saving, likewise, tightens the budgets of households today. Put another way, reserves from this source are the consequence of suppressing private consumption in favor of business competitiveness. One may also point to a final source, as others in this House have, interest on reserves which go back into reserves. Now, this is making money from money, and while it owes its provenance to careful reserve management by our sovereign wealth funds and central bank, they are derivatives of the fact that we had, at some point in the past, either excess government or private savings to begin with. Now, keeping in mind what I've shared, it should be clear that given where our reserves come from, who they ultimately belong to. Or prudent fiscal management undeniably contributes to ensuring that these are not squandered. The ultimate source of all our reserves is when we ask our people to consume less today. Our nation's eye-watering reserve stock was built on the backs of sacrifices made by our past and present generations for the sake of future needs. Our nation's reserves belong, therefore, to the people, not to the government. What does this mean? It means that our government is a steward for our reserves. That means that they have been entrusted with managing it, growing it, and dispersing it. And like any good steward, government may suggest how much we should be setting aside and when we should be drawing it down. But when the government exercises high-handedness in its management of the reserves, it will naturally strike us as overwrought exercises of its authority. Now, if reserves belong to the people, then it should follow that certain principles apply. One is transparency. That's why, across the world, sovereign wealth and public pension funds in democratic societies routinely publish their reserve holdings. This goes beyond sound principles and best practices. Adherence to transparency simply means that you're respecting the rights of the owner to know what they own. Few people I know would be happy if their banks did not permit them to know or check the value of their current balances or to know the contents of their wallet. I mean, the Simply Go debacle demonstrated amply that people were even unhappy when they could not instantaneously know how much they had left in their transport accounts. More generally, such transparency also ensures that reserves are held accountable in real time to their owners. This is why the current practice, where the portfolio assets of Temasek and the foreign exchange holdings of MAS are known, but the assets of GIC remain concealed, runs afoul of this principle. The usual justification trotted out for keeping part of our reserves unreported is inspired by the intuition underlying military conflict. The government has appealed to how the secrecy could how the absence of this secrecy could make us more vulnerable to speculative attacks on the Singapore dollar, since presumably markets might hold back when betting against an opponent when it's uncertain about the size of its arsenal. Yet, even here, the analogy is tenuous. MINDEF routinely trots out information about the latest and greatest hardware secured by our Army, Navy, and Air Force. Our National Day Parade includes a military component, no doubt to further signal our impressive defense capabilities. Of course, some of this is kept unknown, and for that reason, for strategic ambiguity. Yes, but we certainly do not wish to undersell how much we have, in case we diminish the deterrent effect. It's like keeping your largest weapon in the arsenal secret, and that would, I contend, do exactly that. But there is even a sound economic case for revealing this information. Forex traders need not and often do not agree. This is why publishing our full reserves may avail an additional benefit. If we face speculators that are selling the Sing dollar, say, the information could goad into action market participants who may instead buy our currency if they believe that our fundamentals are strong. Such stabilizing speculation lends stability, not instability. To follow with the military analogy, this revelation allows our allies to better provide support to our military effort. Now, in any case, the MAS has itself adjudged that the amount required for business as usual management of our exchange rate regime amounts to between 65 and 75% of GDP. Official data reveals that reserves from MAS and Temasek, together with the publicly acknowledged amount of at least 100 billion from GIC, means that it's in excess of 1.2 trillion, as PSP has suggested. Now, even with this lower bound, which is likely to understate the size of a reserve, is already close to twice our GDP, multiples more that of what the government has itself stated is reasonable for defending our currency. And surely we would not be willing to sacrifice anything akin to twice our national income just to defend our currency. Given this vast disconnect, it is befuddling why the notion of secrecy is even necessary to defend the exchange rate, and yet it is still trotted out by this government. Furthermore, other jurisdictions have shown that such transparency, far from being detrimental to operational effectiveness, are consistent with either size or performance. The world's largest single sovereign wealth fund, the Government Pension Fund of Japan, is open about its assets and performance. The world's second largest fund, Norway's GPF Global, routinely tops measures of global transparency. These funds have not compromised transparency even as they have produced credible returns. In contrast, the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia was allowed to go on in part for as long as it did because of the opaque environment in which it operated. While I'm not suggesting our SWFs fall in this category, there's evidence that points to a positive relationship between high governance standards and superior returns. Now, what transparency ultimately buys, therefore, is accountability. It is only through routine disclosure of reserve holdings and their returns that the stewards of our money may be held to account. This includes frequent updates on asset exposure and fund performance, which most obviously include annual returns, not just those from medium-term windows. Now, setting aside how this is standard practice for all credible funds, it also means that managers can be held to account before things go awry. Some may argue that this could place undue pressure on our SWFs to be beholden to political pressures. To this, I would say three things. First, we do want some degree of pressure, albeit on the political office holders overseeing our SWF's investment mandate. This is a healthy state of affairs. This sort of scrutiny is precisely what accountability is about. Funds around the world, whether public or private, face such pressure from their shareholders. Second, if we think that annual returns might induce an excessive focus on the short run, which is the case for GIC, then the fact that multiple longer run windows precisely allows the public to credibly evaluate whether poor returns in any given year are a one-off blip or indicative of something more systemic. And finally, the government frequently states that it does not intervene in SWF investment decisions anyhow. If they are already thus insulated, why not the added accountability? Knowledge about asset exposures go beyond investment considerations. It can reveal, for instance, if our SWFs hold assets in industries that could either potentially run afoul of the national interests or be inconsistent with the stated resolutions of Parliament. For example, while some information is presumably reported to the MAS as the regulator, the public does not know and is unable to scrutinize if our SWFs may inadvertently hold Russian assets tied to sanctioned individuals or entities. Similarly, we do not know what share of our SWFs portfolios comprise industries that contribute actively to climate change, an issue that this House itself has deemed a global emergency. The third and final principle is consultation. Given that we are a democracy, the decision on whether we should be using more or less of our reserves should be a common, collective decision, one that is arrived at after a process of proper deliberation over their best use with full information available. We could decide, of course, as a nation, to be conservative and only draw on reserves in emergencies, as the member, Mr. Liang, has suggested. But we could also just as well decide that we would rather partially relieve the wrenching cost of living pressures our people face residing in one of the most expensive cities in the world. In a similar vein, we could be Kiasu, investing conservatively so as to hoard as much as possible for a rainy day. But by the same token, we could say that this Kiasuism is inefficient and harmful. With such a long horizon, it would be better to be more aggressive in investing, in putting our money to work, and perhaps by investing more domestically today than we do. That's why I believe it makes sense for GIC to train its eyes toward global investment for international diversification benefits, while Temasek focus much more on local opportunities, supporting the efforts of Singaporeans to reinvest in their home country. The bottom line is that unless we have a serious conversation as a nation and people over the proper use of our reserves, one with full information of what we have and what we should set aside, we will never arrive at a position where we are comfortable with what is being spent, whether in terms of our net investment returns contribution or even the amount we hold as principal. It's unconscionable that the people saving do not get a fair hearing in a democratic society with the vague reassurance that we only need to trust the government, that the government is being prudent. And any efforts to alter the usage of reserves amounts to some charge of fiscal irresponsibility. And that's why, for me, the use of emotive terms like raiding the reserves makes little sense. The distinction is unnecessary After all, any amount of income that we choose not to set aside as saving, even 1 cent, would logically amount to taking away from the reserves. So, if it's applied to the Workers' Party suggestion that we avoid a hike in GST by reducing the share of reserve interest, not the principal, but the interest that is being returned to reserves, it should apply with equal force when the PAP chose to alter the formula for net investment income to introduce the NIRC in 2008, or to add Temasek to the framework in 2015. More importantly, the charge is also not useful, since it distracts us from the choices that really matter. And these choices surround how much we wish to burden the people of today in exchange for promises of the future. When claims are made that there's no such thing as oversaving, it smacks of rigid ideology, not reasoned debate. More saving is better, but only if we aren't making undue sacrifices today. Economics is sometimes defined as the science of allocating scarce resources to unlimited wants. I would argue this applies not only between our needs in any given period, but also across time as well, between yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Our reserves, after all, are not exempt from the laws of economics when we are told in a high-handed way that we cannot spend down our inheritance for our own good, even when our people are struggling with record high cost of living. It smacks of paternalism. It amounts to saying that when we decide that spending more to take care of the elderly who made the sacrifices necessary to make up the reserves in the first place, it is unfair to the future, and we diminish the contributions of the past. It amounts to suggesting to parents who want to create a better environment for their kids by having to spend more of their tuition fees or creating a better home environment that they don't really know any better. Now, it will not surprise members of this House that the three principles I outlined of transparency, accountability, and consultation are foundational ones embedded in the Santiago Principles, a set of best practices for sovereign investments agreed to by the National Working Group of SWFs, for which GIC and Temasek are signatories. GIC, however, fares poorly on a range of transparency indicators, and Temasek is particularly opaque on its accountability surrounding governance structures. We should be striving for our SWFs to be topping this global benchmark, much like how we do for other global comparison exercises. Perhaps more fundamentally, subscribing to transparency, accountability, and consultation ensures that the amounts we hold in our reserves have legitimacy in the eyes of the people who actually own them. That is ultimately what a reasonable debate about our reserves should be about. Mr. Speaker, I cannot support the amended version of the motion, in part because it suggests that we strike off the importance of review. Given all that I've shared, this review is critical for us to understand the importance of what we can do or cannot do with the people's money. And for that reason, I support the original motion as proposed by the Honourable Member Yong Ma Wai.